When we talk about corruption, there are typical types of individuals that spring to mind. There's the former Soviet megalomaniacs, Saparmurat Niyazov, he was one of them. Until his death in 2006, he was the all-powerful leader of Turkmenistan, a Central Asian country rich in natural gas. Now, he really loved to issue presidential decrees, and one renamed the months of the year, including after himself and his mother. He spent millions of dollars creating a bizarre personality cult, and his crowning glory was the building of a 40-foot-high gold-plated statue of himself, which stood proudly in the capital central square and rotated to follow the sun. He was a slightly unusual guy. And then there's that cliché, the African dictator or minister or official. There's Teodorin Obiang. So his daddy is president for life of Equatorial Guinea, a West African nation that has exported billions of dollars of oil since the 1990s and yet has a truly appalling human rights record. The vast majority of its people are living in really miserable poverty, despite an income per capita that's on a par with that of Portugal. So Obiang Jr., well, he buys himself a $30 million mansion in Malibu, California. I've been up to its front gates, I can tell you, it's a magnificent spread. He bought an 18 million euro art collection that used to belong to fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent. A stack of fabulous sports cars, some costing $1 million apiece. Oh, and a Gulfstream jet too. Now get this. Until recently, he was earning an official monthly salary of less than $7,000. And there's Dan Etete. Well, he was a former oil minister of Nigeria under President Abacha. And it just so happens he's a convicted money launderer too. We've spent a great deal of time investigating a $1 billion, that's right, a $1 billion oil deal that he was involved with. And what we found was pretty shocking, but more about that later. So it's easy to think that corruption happens somewhere kind of over there, carried out by a bunch of greedy despots and individuals up to no good in countries that we personally may know very little about and feel really unconnected to and unaffected by what might be going on. But does it just happen over there? Well, at 22, I was very lucky. My first job out of university was investigating the illegal trade in African ivory. And that's how my relationship with corruption really began. In 1993, with two friends who were colleagues, Simon Taylor and Patrick Alley, we set up an organization called Global Witness. Our first campaign was investigating the role of illegal logging in funding the war in Cambodia. So a few years later, and it's now 1997, and I'm in Angola, undercover, investigating blood diamonds. Perhaps you saw the film, the Hollywood film Blood Diamond, the one with Leonardo DiCaprio. Well, some of that sprang from our work. Luanda, it was full of landmine victims who were struggling to survive on the streets, and war orphans living in sewers under the streets, and a tiny, very wealthy elite who gossiped about shopping trips to Brazil and Portugal. And it was a slightly crazy place. So I'm sitting in a hot and very stuffy hotel room, feeling just totally overwhelmed. But it wasn't about blood diamonds, because I'd been speaking to lots of people there who, well, they talked about a different problem. That of a massive web of corruption on a global scale and millions of oil dollars going missing. And for what was then a very small organization of just a few people, trying to even begin to think how we might tackle that was an enormous challenge. And in the years that I've been, and we've all been, campaigning and investigating, I've repeatedly seen that what makes corruption on a global, massive scale possible, well, it isn't just greed or the misuse of power or that nebulous phrase, weak governance. I mean, yes, it's all of those. But corruption, it's made possible by the actions of global facilitators. So let's go back to some of those people I talked about earlier. Now, they're all people we've investigated, and they're all people who couldn't do what they do alone. Take Obiang Jr. Well, he didn't end up with high-end art and luxury houses without help. He did business with global banks. A bank in Paris held accounts of companies controlled by him, one of which was used to buy the art. And American banks, well, they funneled $73 million into the States, some of which was used to buy that Californian mansion. And he didn't do all this in his own name either. He used shell companies. He used one to buy the property and another, which was in somebody else's name, to pay the huge bills it cost to run the place. And then there's Dan Etete. Well, when he was oil minister, he awarded an oil block now worth over $1 billion to a company that, guess what? Yeah, he was the hidden owner of. Now, it was then much later traded on with the kind assistance of the Nigerian government, I have to be careful what I say here, to subsidiaries of Shell and the Italian Eni, two of the biggest oil companies around. So the reality is that the engine of corruption, well, it exists far beyond the shores of countries like Equatorial Guinea or Nigeria or Turkmenistan. This engine, well, it's driven by our international banking system, by the problem of anonymous shell companies, and by the secrecy that we have afforded big oil, gas and mining operations. And, most of all, by the failure of our politicians to back up their rhetoric and do something really meaningful and systemic to tackle this stuff. And then there's the problem of anonymous shell companies. Well, we've all heard about what they are, I think, and we all know they're used quite a bit by people and companies who are trying to avoid paying their proper dues to society, also known as taxes. But what doesn't usually come to light is how shell companies are used to steal huge sums of money, transformational sums of money from poor countries. In virtually every case of corruption that we've investigated, shell companies have appeared. And sometimes it's been impossible to find out who was really involved in the deal. A recent study by the World Bank looked at 200 cases of corruption. It found that over 70% of those cases had used anonymous shell companies, totaling almost $56 billion. Now, many of these companies were in America and the United Kingdom, its overseas territories and crown dependencies, and so it's not just an offshore problem, it's an onshore one too. You see, shell companies, they're central to the secret deals which may benefit wealthy elites rather than ordinary citizens. And finally, well, there are those who believe that corruption is unavoidable. It's just how some business is done. It's too complex and difficult to change. So in effect, we just accept it. But as a campaigner and investigator, I have a different view because I've seen what can happen when an idea gains momentum. In the oil and mining sector, for example, there is now the beginning of a truly worldwide transparency standard that could tackle some of these problems. In 1999, when Global Witness called for oil companies to make payments on deals transparent, well, some people laughed at the extreme naivety of that small idea. But literally hundreds of civil society groups from around the world came together to fight for transparency. And now it's fast becoming the norm and the law. 2/3 of the value of the world's oil and mining companies are now covered by transparency laws. 2/3. So this is change happening. This is progress. But we're not there yet by far, because it really isn't about corruption somewhere over there, is it? In a globalized world, corruption is a truly globalized business, and one that needs global solutions supported and pushed by us all as global citizens, right here. Thank you.